Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey into the past. Imagine standing at the gates of the Eternal City, Rome, the beating heart of an empire that once stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the deserts of Arabia. The streets bustle with merchants selling goods from distant lands, silks from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt. Marble temples glisten in the sun, aqueducts carry fresh water into the city, and the Colosseum echoes with the roar of the crowd. Rome, at its height, seemed indestructible, and yet, like all things in history, even the mightiest empires fall. The story of Rome's collapse is not one of a single cataclysm, but of centuries of challenges, political, economic, social, and military, that gradually eroded the foundations of its power. Over the next 2 hours, we will walk through this saga: the rise of Rome, its golden age, the cracks in its foundations, and the events that led to its final collapse in 476 AD. But we will also see how Rome never truly disappeared, how its spirit lived on in law, religion, culture, and memory. This is not just the story of an empire's fall. It is a mirror held up to all civilizations, a reminder that greatness brings not only glory, but also vulnerability. The question Rome asks us is one still relevant today. How do empires rise, and why do they fall? Let us begin. To understand Rome's fall, we must first understand its rise. Rome began not as a mighty empire, but as a small settlement on the banks of the river Tiber. Legend tells us of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers raised by a she-wolf, who founded the city in 753 BC. While myth and reality blur, what is certain is that Rome grew from humble beginnings into a republic, and then into an empire that dominated the known world. The Roman Republic, founded around 509 BC, was built on a system of checks and balances between the Senate, the magistrates, and the assemblies of citizens. It was during this time that Rome expanded across Italy, defeating rivals like the Etruscans, the Samnites, and finally, the powerful city of Carthage in the Punic Wars. Hannibal and his elephants famously crossed the Alps, but in the end, Rome prevailed. By the 1st century BC, Rome had become a Mediterranean superpower, yet this success came at a cost. Enormous wealth flowed into the city, creating vast inequalities. Ambitious generals like Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus vied for power, leading to civil war. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC signaled the end of the Republic. After his assassination in 44 BC, chaos reigned until his adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, emerged as Rome's first emperor. Under Augustus, Rome entered its golden age. He established peace, reorganized the army, and reformed the administration. The empire expanded its borders, reaching an unprecedented level of prosperity and stability. But the seeds of future decline were already being sown. Rome's reliance on conquest for wealth, its dependence on slaves, and its growing bureaucracy created tensions that would resurface centuries later. The rise of Rome was meteoric, but as history shows, what rises swiftly may also one day fall. From the reign of Augustus in 27 BC until roughly 180 AD, Rome experienced what historians call the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. For nearly 2 centuries, the empire enjoyed stability and prosperity unprecedented in the ancient world. Roads linked distant provinces, aqueducts supplied water to cities, and Roman law created a sense of order across vast territories. Trade flourished. Goods traveled along the Silk Road from China, across the deserts of Arabia, and through the ports of the Mediterranean. Roman citizens could enjoy exotic luxuries, while local farmers supplied wheat, wine, and olive oil. The empire was a cosmopolitan world, where Latin and Greek served as common languages, and people from Gaul to Egypt could call themselves Roman. Emperors like Trajan and Hadrian embodied this golden age. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest extent, conquering Dacia and pushing the borders deep into the east. Hadrian, by contrast, consolidated these gains, famously building Hadrian's Wall in Britain to mark the empire's limits. Culturally, Rome thrived. Literature, art, and architecture reached new heights. The poet Virgil wrote the Aeneid, linking Rome's destiny to the gods. Engineers constructed monumental works such as the Pantheon, whose dome still inspires awe today. But even in this era of peace, cracks were visible. Maintaining such a vast empire required immense resources. The army consumed enormous sums, and the empire depended heavily on taxation and new conquests to sustain itself. Social inequality deepened. The poor crowded into Rome's insulae or apartment blocks, while elites lived in luxurious villas. For now, however, the empire's power seemed eternal. Few could imagine that within 3 centuries, the Western Roman Empire would cease to exist. Yet the story of Rome's fall begins even as its glory shone brightest. The Roman Empire, vast and powerful, seemed unshakable. Yet beneath the surface, problems were beginning to emerge. Historians often debate whether Rome's fall was inevitable, but what is certain is that the cracks began forming long before the final collapse. By the 3rd century, political instability became rampant. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, many assassinated by their own guards. The Praetorian Guard, originally created to protect the emperor, became kingmakers, auctioning off the throne to the highest bidder. This constant cycle of violence eroded faith in leadership. Economically, Rome faced mounting challenges. Conquests had slowed, meaning the steady influx of wealth and slaves diminished. Without expansion, the empire relied increasingly on taxation. Heavy burdens fell on farmers and small landowners, many of whom abandoned their lands. This decline in agricultural production led to shortages and rising food prices. Inflation spiraled out of control. The silver content of Roman coins was reduced repeatedly, undermining confidence in currency. The gap between rich and poor grew wider. While senators and aristocrats flaunted their wealth, common citizens struggled to survive. Social unrest brewed. The promise of citizenship, once Rome's great unifying force, seemed hollow as the empire grew more corrupt. Loyalty to Rome began to wane. Soldiers, once fiercely devoted to the state, increasingly served their generals rather than the empire. Mercenaries from beyond Rome's borders were recruited to fill the ranks, but their loyalty was to gold, not Rome. Even the mighty city of Rome itself was not immune. Though still a hub of culture and politics, its population grew dependent on bread and circuses, free grain and public entertainment to pacify unrest. Gladiatorial games and chariot races distracted the masses from their hardships, but they could not hide the empire's growing fragility. Rome was still a giant, but one walking on unsteady legs. The empire's foundations, once so solid, were beginning to erode. The economy of Rome was both its greatest strength and eventually one of its greatest weaknesses. At its peak, the empire was a hub of trade. Goods flowed from east to west, north to south. Roman roads and shipping lanes made movement efficient and wealth poured into the empire. But prosperity was uneven. A small elite controlled vast estates worked by slaves, while small farmers, once the backbone of the republic, struggled to compete. Many abandoned their land, swelling the urban poor population in cities. Taxation became increasingly oppressive. To fund the army, bureaucracy, and public works, emperors raised taxes to crushing levels. Farmers who could not pay fled their lands, and the state lost vital agricultural output. Over time, entire regions became depopulated. Trade, once flourishing, also faced challenges. Piracy in the Mediterranean disrupted shipping. Constant warfare strained supply lines. The empire's reliance on grain from North Africa left it vulnerable when those territories were threatened. Inflation further destabilized the economy. Roman coins, once trusted, were repeatedly debased. The denarius, once nearly pure silver, contained only a fraction of its original value by the 3rd century. Confidence in money eroded, and barter often replaced currency in the provinces. Socially, discontent simmered. The promise of stability under Roman rule no longer felt secure. The divide between the wealthy elite and the impoverished masses created tension. Cities grew overcrowded, sanitation worsened, and disease spread. The empire had grown too large, its system too unwieldy. Maintaining armies on distant frontiers, feeding massive urban populations, and managing vast bureaucracy strained resources to the breaking point. What had once been Rome's strength, its size and diversity, became a source of vulnerability. The empire could no longer sustain itself on the old model. Economic troubles fed into social unrest, and social unrest fed into political instability. Rome was entering a dangerous cycle, one that would accelerate its decline. If economics weakened Rome's body, politics poisoned its heart. The empire's political system, once a source of strength, descended into chaos. In the early centuries of the empire, succession was often orderly, with emperors adopting competent heirs. But by the 3rd century, assassinations, coups, and usurpations became common. Between 235 and 284 AD, the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, more than 20 emperors ruled in quick succession, most dying violently. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect the emperor, often acted as kingmakers. Corruption flourished, loyalty was bought with gold, and betrayal was always a heartbeat away. Civil wars drained resources and left frontiers vulnerable. Senators, once powerful voices in Roman politics, were sidelined as emperors ruled with increasing autocracy. Local administrators, often corrupt, extorted taxes and enriched themselves at the expense of ordinary citizens. The idea of shared civic duty, which had once defined Rome, eroded. Legitimacy became fragile. With emperors rising and falling so quickly, it became hard for people to believe in the stability of the empire. Soldiers pledged allegiance to whichever general promised them the most rewards, undermining loyalty to the state itself. This political instability weakened Rome's ability to respond to external threats. While emperors fought each other for power, enemies at the borders grew bolder. The empire was stretched thin, its strength dissipated by internal struggles. Rome had built its greatness on unity, discipline, and civic responsibility. By the 3rd century, these values seemed like distant memories. Corruption, ambition, and selfishness replaced them. Rome was a giant empire, but one increasingly unable to govern itself effectively. Politics had become Rome's fatal flaw. As Rome weakened from within, danger mounted from without. For centuries, the empire had fought and absorbed neighboring peoples, Germans, Gauls, and countless tribes. But by the late empire, the tide had turned. The Huns, fierce nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia, swept into Europe in the 4th century. Their advance pushed Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and others, into Roman territory, seeking refuge and land. At first, Rome tried to manage this migration, settling some tribes within the empire as allies known as foederati, but mistreatment and exploitation bred resentment. In 378 AD, the Visigoths, tired of Roman abuses, rebelled. At the Battle of Adrianople, they annihilated a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens. It was a devastating blow, proving that Rome was no longer invincible. Over the next decades, waves of migrations and invasions battered the empire. The Vandals crossed into Spain and then into North Africa, seizing Rome's vital grain supply. The Franks and Burgundians carved out territories in Gaul. The Angles and Saxons began settling in Britain. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Alaric and his Visigoths sacked the city of Rome itself. Though Rome was no longer the political capital of the empire, the psychological impact was immense. The eternal city had been violated. Rome's borders, once so secure, had become porous. The empire could no longer control the movement of peoples across its frontiers. Armies were stretched thin, loyalty was uncertain, and the once mighty Roman war machine was faltering. The barbarians, once held at bay, were now inside the empire's walls. Rome's enemies had become its neighbors, its soldiers, and ultimately, its conquerors. By the late 3rd century, it had become clear that the Roman Empire was simply too vast to be governed effectively from one center. Emperor Diocletian, a shrewd and practical ruler, sought to solve this problem with a bold reform. In 285 AD, he divided the empire into 2 halves. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Byzantium, later renamed Constantinople, and the Western Roman Empire, ruled from Rome, and later Ravenna. This division was not merely administrative. It reflected real differences between East and West. The Eastern Empire was richer, more urbanized, and strategically located on the crossroads of trade between Europe and Asia. Its cities thrived, its culture flourished, and its defenses were strong. The Western Empire, by contrast, was poorer, more rural, and more vulnerable to barbarian incursions. Diocletian also introduced the Tetrarchy, or rule of 4, dividing power between 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors. For a time, this system brought stability. But once Diocletian retired, rivalry among his successors plunged the empire back into civil war. The division proved enduring. While the East weathered crises, the West staggered under the weight of invasions, economic decline, and political turmoil. In hindsight, Diocletian's reform was both a solution and a symptom, a recognition that the empire had grown too unwieldy to survive as a single entity. The Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, would endure for another 1,000 years. The Western Empire, however, entered its final agonizing centuries. While Rome's political and military structures faltered, a spiritual revolution reshaped its identity. Christianity, once a small sect persecuted by emperors like Nero, had grown steadily across the empire. Its message of hope, salvation, and equality attracted the poor, the oppressed, and eventually even the elites. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine changed everything. After claiming victory under the sign of the cross, he legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Soon, Christianity spread openly, gaining imperial support. By the end of the century, under Theodosius I, it became the official religion of the empire. This transformation was profound. Temples once dedicated to Jupiter and Mars were abandoned or repurposed as churches. Pagan rituals that had bound Roman society together for centuries faded. Christianity offered a new moral order, one that emphasized spiritual salvation over earthly conquest. Some historians argue that Christianity weakened Rome's martial spirit, turning focus away from traditional civic duty and military service. Others contend it strengthened the empire by uniting people under a common faith. What is clear is that Christianity reshaped Rome's culture, values, and identity. The Church emerged as a powerful institution, filling the vacuum left by failing political structures. Bishops became influential leaders, guiding not only religious life but also civic affairs. In the centuries after Rome's fall, the Church would preserve much of Roman knowledge and act as a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. Christianity did not cause Rome's fall, but it transformed what Rome meant. No longer just a political empire, Rome became a spiritual one, the heart of Christendom, whose influence would extend far beyond the empire's borders. In the 5th century, a series of humiliations struck at the very heart of Rome. The Eternal City, once unassailable, became a target for those it could no longer control. The first great shock came in 410 AD, when Alaric and his Visigoths marched into Rome and sacked it. For 3 days the city was looted, though Alaric spared its churches. The event stunned the Roman world. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem, famously wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Just a few decades later, in 455 AD, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals, led by King Genseric. The Vandals stripped the city of its treasures, carrying away wealth accumulated over centuries. Their name would forever be associated with wanton destruction, though in truth, their sack was more controlled than legend suggests. These repeated invasions revealed Rome's vulnerability. The city, once the beating heart of an empire, was now a symbol of decline. Though the administrative capital had shifted to Ravenna, the psychological weight of Rome's humiliation was immense. Meanwhile, other provinces slipped away. Britain was abandoned. Gaul and Spain fractured into barbarian kingdoms. North Africa, Rome's breadbasket, was lost to the Vandals. Each loss weakened the Western Empire further, depriving it of resources, soldiers, and legitimacy. The sackings of Rome marked not just military defeats, but the collapse of an idea. The idea that Rome was eternal, unshakable, destined to rule forever. For the people of the 5th century, the unthinkable had already happened. The end was near. The Western Empire, weakened by centuries of decline, limped toward its end. By the mid-5th century, its authority was hollow. Puppet emperors were installed and deposed by powerful generals or barbarian leaders. One of the most formidable threats came from Attila the Hun. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila ravaged much of Europe in the 440s and 450s. Though he was checked at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451 AD, the devastation he wrought left the empire staggering. In Italy itself, emperors held little real power. The true rulers were generals like Ricimer, who manipulated and controlled young emperors to serve his own ends. The Senate still existed, but its voice was faint, a shadow of its former influence. Finally, in 476 AD, the charade ended. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor of the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. The symbolism was striking. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, and Augustus, the first great emperor. With his fall, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. Odoacer declared himself king of Italy, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Eastern emperor accepted the gesture, recognizing that Rome's western half was beyond saving. To contemporaries, the fall of Rome was both shocking and inevitable. Some mourned the end of an age. Others saw it as a transition to something new. The Western Empire had collapsed, but life went on. Kingdoms rose in its place, carrying pieces of Roman tradition into the medieval world. And so the Western Roman Empire fell. But Rome itself never truly died. In the East, the Byzantine Empire carried on Roman traditions for another 1,000 years, preserving Greek and Roman knowledge, law, and culture. In the West, the Catholic Church became the guardian of Rome's spiritual legacy, keeping Latin alive and transmitting Roman thought to medieval Europe. The Renaissance, centuries later, revived Roman art, literature, and philosophy, reminding the world of its classical roots. Modern governments drew inspiration from Roman law and republican ideals. Our languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and even English, bear the imprint of Latin. Architecture, engineering, and literature still echo Rome's achievements. The fall of Rome was not the end of civilization, but a transformation. It marked the passage from the ancient world to the medieval, from empire to kingdoms, from polytheism to Christianity. Rome fell, but Rome endured. As we look back, the story of Rome is not simply a tale of decline. It is a reminder of the fragility of greatness, of the dangers of overreach, corruption, and division. But it is also a testament to the resilience of ideas, culture, and human achievement. Rome fell, but Rome lives on, in our laws, our languages, our cities, and our imagination. The Eternal City still stands, and with it the memory of an empire that changed the world.